This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. In 1972, when my father, who had just gotten out of the Marine Corps, relocated our family to Georgia from Louisiana, I was a kid. He took me for a drive in Atlanta, Georgia. And you know how it is when you're little, the world that you're surrounded by at that age seems so big. You can go to your grandparents' house. You can think about it back then. Things seem so much bigger than they actually were, particularly when you get to revisit those locations as an adult. But, you know, back then in 1972, I was in the front seat of his Ford pickup truck, and we were driving down the road. He said, "I'm going to take you somewhere and show you where the meanest men in America live." Now, this is in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had no idea. I didn't even know anything about Atlanta. We just moved there. So we're riding down the road, and suddenly I look through the windshield at his direction. He said, "Look straight ahead." And all I could see was this big gray mass of buildings surrounded by fencing. And as we grew closer and closer, those buildings filled up the entire windshield. You couldn't see anything but gray, massive gray stone. And what I was looking at was actually the federal penitentiary that is located in Atlanta, Georgia, and it looked scary. And as I came to find out later, some of the most notorious criminals in America had been placed there and had passed through there at some point in time. I was amazed at the names. And even as an adult, when I began to work in Atlanta as a representative of the medical examiner's office, every now and then I'd have to drive by that prison. And even in a passing glance, that child that I was back in 72 would reemerge, and I still viewed that place as very, very scary. But there's another scary place that is a federal facility, and it's located in Manhattan. And we're going to talk today about one of the former residents there. We're going to talk about the death of Jeffrey Epstein. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I thought about you. You and I have so many commonalities growing up, essentially roughly the same circa, I guess. Mm-hmm. Do you have those memories of places that were daunting to you as a child, and then maybe you revisit them when you're older and it doesn't seem that way?
When I was a kid growing up in Southern California, and as we would drive from where we lived in Orange County to my grandpa and grandmother's house in North Hollywood, we would drive by, downtown Los Angeles. You could see all the buildings, the important buildings. And I was a little kid, right. Okay? But I remember my mother pointing to one of the buildings and saying, "That is where Sirhan is right now." Wow. And she would give it. We had 5 kids in our family, and my mother would give the history of who he was, and other criminals that were localized. But that's the one I remember the most was, and she said, "When you get older, you need to look into that." And she wasn't a conspiracy person, but she was very topical, current, active, in politics and things. And I remember this building, and it's a building like if you watch Dragnet or Adam 12 or any of the, shows from the late 60s and early 70s of crime in LA. Yeah. They had the same building, the municipal building. And I remember that. And I remember I would always try to look at the top of it to see I wonder if he's looking out the window, that kind of thing.
No kid. And you know what? That building is so iconic. I think it's actually on LAPD's badge.
Probably is.
When you look at an LAPD badge, that building is on there. And it's really cool. Those badges are something to see. but yeah, there are those moments in time that, that you kind of drift back. Stepping back just a second, I have to say that the morning that he was discovered deceased, I had a producer at then HLN, that doesn't exist anymore, reach out to me and say, "Can you come to studio?" We would, and I'll never forget it. I was on air with this one of my favorite reporters, a lady named Elizabeth Pran, and the reason I really like her is her husband was a pitcher for the Braves, and she, I'd ask her about her husband, but I remember sitting there and having heard everything about Epstein over the years leading up to this moment in time where he was now confirmed to be deceased. I was thinking it was kind of a surreal moment, because they're flashing, and when you're in one of these studios, they're flashing up on the screen those big images, and you try not to look at the images because you're looking at the person talking to you.
Right.
I couldn't help it. I kept cutting my eye over, and I was thinking, they've got me here talking about this on a Sunday morning. I was amazed that I was having that conversation. And I remember then thinking, how in the world could arguably, I guess, one of the most recognizable, convicted, and also continued to be accused criminals in the world be dead? Be dead in a federal facility that, when you think about it, I think that our mind often defaults to this idea that, okay, it's a federal facility. It's a lockdown. It's probably, arguably, maybe one of the most secure places in all of Manhattan, at least,
right?
If not the Eastern Seaboard. I don't know. But nonetheless, he was dead.
They kept all the biggest, hardest criminals up there, but while they're in the process of heading to trial, his roommate, at the time, his cellie was a former cop who had killed 4 people, was a bodybuilder, steroid doing that, and was a big crime guy there. I mean, they had the biggest criminals right there.
They did.
Here's the key, though. You mentioned the day he was found dead. I remember before that, on July 23rd, when he was attacked in his cell or tried to commit suicide, depending. All right. We covered that on Nancy Grace. Got a phone call that, hey, we got to get on this story. And so before the death, we were going in depth. We'd already done a number of stories on Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, trying to figure out how to spell her name.
And pronounce it.
Oh, yeah. That was butchered so many times until we finally got to Ghislaine. Anyway, we covered it. For those of you listening to the program Body Bags, if you don't know the Jeffrey Epstein story, we could start talking about it now. I looked over the timeline, and we could do 5 shows on it, not get all the information, and still not make it to where we're starting today. Right now, we're at the point where Jeffrey Epstein is in jail. He has been arrested and charged with a number of crimes, and they all involve sex with minors, with underage young ladies. And the abuse and rape, and it's pretty extensive because of his friends. He had friends that stretched all the way to the Royal Palace in England, to the White House in Washington, D.C., and many points in between. He's a multimillionaire. On July 23rd, he was already in prison. He was already at MCC. And we got this story that he had tried to commit suicide. We didn't know if he was dead. We didn't know what was going on. But it turned out that he had injuries. 1:27 in the morning, July 23rd, corrections officers responded to his cell where they found him with an orange cloth around his neck. His cellmate told officers that Epstein tried to hang himself. Medical staff examined Epstein, observed friction marks and superficial reddening around his neck and on his knee, and they placed him on suicide watch. Board of Prisons policy requires that inmates identified as suicide risks be placed on suicide watch until they're no longer an imminent threat. It means watching them 24/7 camera, not, all the time. And it gets less restrictive. But the reason this is important is because of what happened here. At first, it was his cellie saying he tried to commit suicide. But they looked at it and like, well, the injuries don't match a suicide. It doesn't fit. And they're like, and by the way, why didn't you stop him? Or why didn't you tell somebody? And then it went, well, I'm not sure. And Epstein said he didn't know what happened. He didn't remember anything. At first, he said his cellmate attacked him. That was the other thing. He said his cellmate attacked him and tried to kill him. And then when they came back and they're like, okay, cellmate said you tried to commit suicide. You're saying it was the cellmate. And by then, Epstein changes his story. He says, I don't know what happened. I can't remember anything, and I'm not talking anymore. And that was it.
Yeah, that sounds, obviously, I don't know. My first reaction to that, Dave, when you say it, is that this sounds like somebody that's terrified. And let's look back at this guy. We're talking about how much money he had. Just the home that he had in Manhattan, this brownstone that he lived in, I guess you would call it a brownstone. Some people refer to it as a mansion by New York standards. That structure alone is massive. And I think by anybody's standards, this guy has money. Obviously, they talk about Little St. James, the island. Who owns an island? And then you think about this huge ranch out in New Mexico that just goes on vast, and you hear all of these stories. And one of the things that always troubled me, and I don't know, maybe I'm just applying too much logic without enough data, but I began to think about all of these young women that had been brought into his sphere. And many of these young women were from places like Eastern Europe. And allegedly, many of them were not just underage, they were significantly underage. And I had thoughts about this, Dave. So after you're done with these young women, do you put them back on a flight and take them to these nowhere places in Eastern Europe where they're recruited from? Where do you go? Do you take them into the U.S. and just like, a caged doves, you just kind of let them go and fly where they want? Or are they wandering around somewhere? What happened to all of those women, those young girls? That was always a head scratcher for me, because the story still has blanks that have yet to be filled in. But I know this. I know that he's deceased, obviously, and under very suspicious circumstances. And for me, as a death investigator, what I have heard, and certainly now, based upon the photographs that have been released from autopsy, have observed, none of these injuries marry up with a classic presentation for hanging. I've never told you this, Dave. I hated working cases in jail facilities. And I've had to over the years. I've had to go for hangings, natural deaths. I've had to visit jail infirmaries for stabbings. I hate it. I despise it. I think a lot of it has to do with you're treated like an inmate when you show up, because all of us forensic guys have, we have scene bags, we have scene kits, and they have to go through all of that stuff. Not that I'm bringing in anything, that I shouldn't have, but they're going to check you out thoroughly. If you're carrying a weapon, you have to surrender that. And then, you walk in and, that old adage about hearing that door shut behind you, it's a real thing, man. I mean, it really is. And the odd thing about being inside of a facility like this is that any noise that is made in there, because of the structure, because of the stone walls or poured walls and all of the metal framing, it amplifies in that environment. So if somebody in a cell, down the way coughs, you hear it. It sounds like they're right next to you. And
so when you go to a jail to examine somebody, do you actually get them? Do you actually go to where it took place, like in the cell?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've specifically done that. Not all people are removed from cells and taken to an infirmary, and and that's one of the things that had occurred allegedly with Epstein. His brother had talked about it extensively, where when Epstein was discovered, one of the jailers actually the jailer had conflicting statements. He said that he tore and then he said he cut this noose away from him that is tied off of the top bunk rail. And
let's back up and get to that.
Yeah.
Let's back up for a minute, Joe, because in reality, when you get there, I have a big question for you about this.
Yeah, sure.
Because when I wanted to set it up properly with July 23rd, 24th, because that attack is why this shouldn't have happened. The reason there is such a focus on August 8th, 9th, and 10th in Jeffrey Epstein's life and death is because of July 23rd, 24th. The man they think he's seriously injured. They go to his cell. He says, my cellie beat me up, tried to kill me. The cellmate says he tried to commit suicide. And then, as you said, he's so scared. He says, I want to keep this guy as my cellmate, and I don't know what happened. I'm not talking anymore. So, some threat, something happened, and they analyzed him. They worked with him. They put him on suicide watch. They did all the things they needed to do. But on July 30th, the psychology department sent an email to 70 MCC New York employees explaining the need for an appropriate cellmate for Jeffrey Epstein. They sent that because the cellmate that was leaving was the former New York cop who had killed 4 people, later convicted and sentenced to prison. But they knew that he was going to be transferred out of the cell on August 8th, and there needed to be another replacement. He was not to be left alone. Because of July 23rd, 24th, Jeffrey Epstein was not to be left alone. He was also supposed to be on suicide watch because of July 23rd, 24th. But as it turned out, by August 8th, U.S. Marshal Service sent 2 emails notifying the MCC staff that Epstein's cellmate was being transferred to another facility on August 9th. No action was taken to make sure Epstein had a suitable cellmate. Epstein met with his attorneys on August the 8th at the prison, not unusual for a criminal. But that particular meeting on August the 8th, Jeffrey Epstein signed a new last will and testament. On August 9th, Epstein's cellmate was removed. This is the lead up from July 23rd, 24th. There have been multiple emails passed. Do not let this man alone. Keep a roommate in there. His roommate leaves. Jeffrey Epstein's left alone. August 9th, after a meeting at the prison with his lawyers, the MCC New York staff allowed Epstein to make a phone call in violation of Board of Prisons policy. It was unrecorded, unmonitored. They don't know who he talked to. They know what he claimed to talk to, but they believe it was somebody else that he had a relationship with. So he's on the phone talking privately with somebody, and that wasn't recorded or monitored or anything. So no telling what he said. Epstein did say he was calling his mother, but they said it was someone else. Anyway, August 9th, inmates are locked in their cells at 8 p.m. Epstein is in a cell by himself for the first time. When they next found him at 6:30 the next morning, they found him dead. Now, before they cut the noose off and everything else, okay, tell me what was going on in that room in Jeffrey Epstein's cell, based on the information we have now, at 6:30 in the morning when the guy comes in there to check him and finds out he's dead. We'll deal with all the things that went wrong to allow that to happen. But bottom line, there was no cellmate as there was supposed to be, and he's dead at 6:30 in the morning.
When he's discovered, according to the reports, his buttocks, he's in a semi-seated position. And yes, you can hang yourself while slumped, seated. I've had people on their knees that have hung themselves. You do not have to be fully suspended. He was seated, but his buttocks was roughly 1 inch to 1.5 inches off of the floor. So when you have people that hang themselves, they have a tendency many times to kind of slip into it and slide slowly down. There's a term that's been floating around, and it's actually referred to as a soft hanging, as opposed to, just think back to Western movies with the gallows, which would be a hard hanging, where you have somebody that drops the force of their body. Jeffrey Epstein weighed approximately 180 pounds. But you don't have this dropping effect. You have somebody that is kind of slowly seated going down. But since his body is allegedly not being supported by the floor, where does that leave the weight? Well, the weight is totally being supported by this noose that has been formed and that is around his neck. Here's the problem. When they got to him, the guard, the corrections officer, said that he said he tore, then he said he cut the noose away. The noose was not recovered and put into evidence. There was another noose that had been tied previously in the cell that was recovered, and there's actually an image of it that you can see. Anybody, I recommend strongly that you go and take a look at it.
There were two nooses, one that was around his neck and one that was just in the room.
Yeah, and there's ripped up orange
Why
cloth.
were there so many sheets in there?
That's my big question. And here's another point as well. Why is this damn place so disordered, Dave? It looks like squalor that he's living in. And
these areas, these cells are usually pretty austere. They don't have a lot of stuff in them because they don't want the inmates to be able to hide anything and squirrel anything away that they can then turn into a means of negotiation.
Oh, listen,
extra blankets and things can turn into money in jail.
Well, do you remember the 60 Minutes episode that came out in the wake of his death? And 60 Minutes was the first. CBS 60 Minutes was the first people to put up images. And I did a screen capture on some of these things. And those images, when you see them, that top bunk that he's suspended from the side of it, but the top bunk itself, let this sink in, didn't have a mattress in it. It was just a flat frame. There is a mattress on the floor. There's a mattress on the lower bunk. But where the mattress would have been on that top bunk, Dave, there's prescription medications up there. You can see them lined up. And, in my experience, one of the things that happens in jails is that you are either, if you're having to take medication, you go to the infirmary and they hand you the medication and they dole it out in the little white cups, or a pharmacy cart comes by with a CO along with it, and they will give you your meds through the door. This guy had meds inside of his cell. How do you explain that with this idea that he has suicidal ideation or that he has attempted suicide? Why are there prescription meds in there? Now, he's also got a CPAP machine, which I think plays into this as well. The cord is laying there adjacent to it on the floor. And then there's all these ripped up bits of cloth, orange cloth. And it looks like, for me, I always imagine jail cells to almost have a military feel to it. Like, you get punished if the place is not squared away. You're not supposed to be laying on your bunk. You're supposed to be, you can sit on your bunk with your feet on the floor. You can sit in a chair that they might provide to you. You can sit on the floor. You're not supposed to be lay. It's supposed to have almost this ordered, not necessarily Spartan, but it's supposed to be squared away. This place was far from it.
Well, you mentioned the CPAP machine.
Yeah.
His brother, Mark, has really come out in the last several weeks and has made a lot of comments. And Mark Epstein and it was Mark Epstein who actually asked Dr. Michael Bodden to observe the autopsy, which I want to get into that. But it was in one of the interviews Mark Epstein did where he talked about the CPAP machine. And he said, there's all these strips of cloth and sheets that are torn in to make a noose. Wouldn't the electrical cable, plug on the CPAP machine been so much easier to use? Yeah. It would have been less time, would have been a lot tougher it just would have been a better thing to do than the sheets.
Yeah, it's got indwelling rigidity, which is
indwelling rigidity.
You've got the wires that are encased inside of a rubber sheath, so it's literally reinforced. I know of a lady that was on a psych unit, and I had to go to the psych unit and work her death because she was in the acute ward and the nurses had let her keep her hair dryer, and she hung herself with her hair dryer. I've seen this done before. It is very much, and again, she was seated. She was seated on the floor and she was on the other side of a hospital bed, tied off on the rail, slid down onto the floor, and she died. So don't try to tell me that it's not possible for this to have occurred. And when you can facilitate it and you have this rigid, semi-rigid cord that would certainly support 180-pound man, but you're going to defer to a piece of cloth to utilize it. And let's face it, this is not like high-end, material. It would be easy to tear, perhaps, and it's hard to fashion something out of it that would work effectively. I'm not saying it couldn't work. I'm just saying that it wouldn't be your first choice in a circumstance like this. And with all of those medications, certainly if you were that desperate to take your own life and you had access to these, why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you take the backing off of the CPAP machine, plug the bare cord into the wall, and hold on to the ends of it and electrocute yourself? I don't know. There's any number of ways you could do it. But yet he chose, according to them, to rip up sheets or clothing and utilize this as some kind of homemade ligature. It just doesn't marry up in my mind, Dave.
Well, it also seems like if you were going to take your own life in a jail cell, you would be mindful of guards walking by, watching video, and you would constantly on the alert for somebody to catch you. And I would think, considering what happened July 23rd, 24th, with whatever happened there, whether he was attacked by his cellmate or tried to commit suicide, he knew that at 1:30 in the morning they would get found out fairly quickly. He wouldn't have a bunch of extra scraps of cloth ripped. He would just get whatever he needed and start and do it. Just get it over with.
Yeah.
And you've got this other cord that would work better. So why are there so many strips of unused cloth, like he's doing a project for school, instead of just getting whatever I have to do to kill myself before the guards come back?
Yeah. And in my history of working suicides, people think that it's kind of this long, drawn-out process where people will sit down and write this long note. Notes are the exception, and most of the time. And the reason I'm saying this is that many times, once people have decided to do this, they do it. It's kind of like standing on a cliff and you're going to jump into a body of water. Everybody's, standing there waiting for you to do it. And finally you get up the gumption to do it and you do it. Why wouldn't he just move forward with that action and take that action at that moment in time? He sits there and kind of ruminates over this. I don't know. I guess he did. But the one thing that we don't know is we don't really know what his activities were now, do we? Because cameras weren't working. The documentation is shoddy at best, particularly as it applies to an inmate that you are actually saying has suicidal ideation. You need to be on this guy 24/7. And listen, you cannot have this lack of self-awareness in the world. You know who he is. I'm not saying he should be treated better than anybody else, but certainly you do grasp the concept that this guy's in the national news, that if he is an accused pedophile, that there might be people within this environment that don't particularly care for pedophiles. We know what happens in incarcerated situations with people that do harm to children. And Lord knows at that time, he's probably the most famous in the world at this level that has been accused of this thing. And having done this over and over and over again, it would seem that it would compel the staff to be even more vigilant, if you will. But of course, in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, that didn't happen. As a medical legal death investigator, I have visited every emergency room within all of the jurisdictions I have worked in. You spend a lot of time in emergency rooms, believe it or not. You show up, if you're working for the coroner, the medical examiner, because that's where the remains are. And you're notified. You're the first person notified when somebody dies. Many times I'd go to the emergency room just so I could take a look, maybe do my own examination, take photos, and then I would determine at that moment in time if we needed to bring the body in for an autopsy or just release the body. But Dave, the best way to observe any dead body is in its pristine state. inside
in the cell.
in the
in
cell,
this case.
in this case, in the cell. But that didn't happen. And even though Jeffrey Epstein was taken down and then removed to the infirmary, they didn't stop there. They went on to a hospital at that point in time.
To get everybody caught up to where we are with the body, because we've got to get into the autopsy, but Epstein wasn't supposed to be alone. He was. The guards were supposed to be watching. They were supposed to be going by every 30 minutes at least, and they were supposed to be watching on video. We now know the video cameras were not working. We know that the guards did not check the cell, not just every 30 minutes, not just every hour. They probably were asleep and or on the internet, Googling things, Facebook, whatever.
You mean the guards? You mean the guards that were convicted?
Yes, the guards that were convicted for not doing their job and then lying about it.
Yeah.
Yes, those are the guards I'm talking about.
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you got that in, because it's an important part of the story that went into this, because suicide or murder. Well, that's what we've got to know. And right now, Joe, I have a lot of suspicion about how many times they were warned, don't leave him alone. How many times they were warned, watch him, who took him off suicide watch when they knew that this guy was a potential threat for suicide.
Right.
But when they took his body out of the cell, he could have been dead for up to 6 hours at that time, Joe. And yet they still went through, he was dead. They still went through all the motions of putting a gown on him at the hospital like he was a live guy there, and took him into the hospital. I'm bringing that up because, is that a common occurrence to take a dead body, an obviously dead body, and put a hospital gown on them at the hospital?
It seems like you're going to great. And most of the time, okay, let me explain it to you this way. His clothing was cut away from his body, which is standard. That does happen because you,
in the cell?
Well, the EMTs had cut it away, apparently, which is even kind of more interesting because he went to the infirmary. So after the EMTs 911 call was placed, so after they made it through all the levels of security with everything they have to make it through there with all of their kits and all that stuff, they finally show up in the infirmary. Were heroic measures being taken? Were they still ongoing at that moment in time? Because we do know that one of the guards started CPR on him and started doing chest compressions. Did that continue on into the infirmary? And then the EMTs took over at that point in time as they were transporting him to the hospital, to the emergency room. But back to your question about, is it common for them to put a hospital gown? I've heard some people call them a Johnny coat, which is kind of interesting. Ties in the back. We've all been subjected to this humiliation in our lives, probably. The times I've seen that happen are generally times where you're going to have family come by and see a body. Because other than that, what's the point? Because they can be covered with a sheet, and in hospitals they use what's referred to as a morgue pack, which is a plastic. It's different than a body bag, but it is a plastic sheet that bodies are almost rolled up in, and then it's got strings that you tie it off on the midsection, you tie it off on the ends. It comes with a diagram how to do it, and then you can place the body after that onto a tray in the hospital morgue in the cooler to preserve the body until the ME can come and get the body. The ME might put the body in a body bag at that point in time. I don't know. It all depends on what their practice is. But most of the time, when I've seen bodies of individuals, certainly you don't put hospital gowns on people that are long dead. And, what does it benefit? What does it profit them to continue to do CPR on somebody that, if in fact they sense that there are postmortem changes going on? Epstein's brother actually states that he was told that he believes that they believed his brother may have been dead for at least 2.5 hours when he was discovered. By that moment in time, you're going to see evidence of things like postmortem lividity, the settling of blood, which we've talked about extensively on body bags, rigor mortis. You'll be able to notice some rigidity in the jaw, which, by the way, would make it very difficult to intubate a person, because you have to open the mouth to get the tube in there, which is one of the steps. If you've got somebody in full cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest, you want to get oxygen flowing. Well, it's it's counterintuitive, right? If somebody's jaw is clenched because of rigor mortis, that's an uphill battle. And for anybody that has any sense about them relative to changes after death, you're going to recognize that. It's literally what we refer to as a cardinal sign of death. So, and again, this is the interesting thing, Dave. We still have yet to even see the EMT run sheet. It has not been released. And I would love to be able to view that and be able to get what their initial assessment was on him when they picked him up at the MCU.
I think at this point, there are so many things suspect that going into the autopsy now, I'm not shocked that Mark Epstein said, I want to have somebody representing my family in there. At this point, there were already so many red flags going up. Mark Epstein is the reason that Dr. Michael Baden was invited in. I did not realize he was invited in to watch the autopsy. I thought it was after the fact. So when you told me that he was actually in there, I thought, well, this is interesting. So,
yeah. Hey, listen, a tip of the cap to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in this case. And I have participated in autopsies where families have representative pathologists there to observe. They generally do not, they're not going to be the prosector, which means they're not going to be the person actually doing the dissection,
watching.
But they will stand there. And generally they won't say a word. They're going to, but it's kind of, see, how can I describe it? You become hyper aware of everything you do because you know that you're being watched in that environment. And if you're doing the right thing, it's no problem. But can you imagine, regardless of how anybody feels about Dr. Baden, whom I respect greatly, I've known Dr. Baden for many years. You've got Michael Baden standing there. I mean, one of the most renowned forensic pathologists anywhere. You have to know that it's a full court press at this point in time. So Dr. Baden is physically there. And according to Mark Epstein, this is where it really, if it couldn't get any more bizarre, the actual person that made the ruling on Epstein's death certificate, and remember, it was first listed as undetermined.
What did they actually find on the autopsy, Joe? What did they see?
Yeah, well, that's the curious thing. When they did get the neck dissected, first off, let me tell you this. I will tell you this. I've seen the images of Epstein's body, Jeffrey Epstein's body, when he is coming. There was a camera going when he was being wheeled into the emergency room. Okay, this is before his body's coming out. You can clearly see his face, and he's cyanotic, which means he's about the color of an eggplant, which is consistent. That is consistent with an asphyxial death, and also being in congestive failure. So he's really purple in color, which you will see. You can see it in hangings. You can see it in manual strangulations. You can see it when somebody is in great respiratory distress and that blood flow is being impeded, it backs up to that level in the neck and it can't kind of recycle.
So they could have the same look, whether they did it themselves or whether I choke you to death or you choke yourself out using a noose. Same look.
Yeah, absolutely. You can still get that cyanotic appearance. And it's really profound when you see the image of him like that. It's striking, as a matter of fact. It catches the eye. And one of the images that I also saw relative to Epstein is his his lower eyelids being retracted, and you can see the petechiae in there. So he's got burst blood vessels on the sclera of his eye. They're there, which again is indicative of an asphyxial death. The question is, there are asphyxial deaths and then there's asphyxial deaths, and so you have to kind of try to understand how do you come to this, how do you arrive at suicide versus something else, perhaps something more sinister. When Epstein's neck was actually dissected, one of the interesting things that was discovered was the fact that his thyroid cartilage was fractured Okay, it's actually got a fracture. The cartilage is actually fractured, which is not unusual in a ligature strangulation. It's also common to see in certain cases of manual strangulation, because if you think about people throttling somebody and they're applying tremendous force to the thyroid cartilage, it can snap, it can break, and it's almost like how can I describe it? Thyroid cartilage is it's like dried wax almost. It has that kind of feeling to it, and so it can actually crack. And I would imagine the older you get, it can possibly become a bit ossified. But here's the other thing: the other landmark in the neck that comes into play is going to be the right greater horn of the hyoid bone. And boy, have we talked about hyoid bones over the years. Thing about it is the hyoid bone is it's removed from the thyroid cartilage. It's up. I mean, it's high. It anchors the tongue in place. And the right greater horn, if you think about it, I urge anybody to just Google it. You can look it up and see what it looks like. So it's the right aspect. It looks like a horseshoe. So imagine the right aspect of the horseshoe, the very tip end of it. It's fractured right there. I think Dr. Bodden said he may have seen another fracture along there, but at least I know the greater horn is fractured, and then the thyroid cartilage is fractured, and it's both on the right side. So how do you arrive at that with a piece of cloth that you've tied to the bed, that it doesn't have the facility for you to jump off of to generate enough energy with your 180 pounds to deliver that kind of force to that specific region where that's going to occur? Now, is it possible for somebody to sit in that slumped position with that direct pressure on there, Dave? And over a period of time, maybe it snaps because of the ongoing pressure? Did he sit down forcefully? Could he have generated enough energy to have sat down that forcefully? Perhaps. But this is one thing that you cannot escape in this case. I don't care how far and how fast you run, you can't get away from the fact that when you see the exterior of Jeffrey Epstein's neck, that furrow that is on his neck runs parallel to his shoulders. That means it goes straight back. That's not the way nooses work, Dave. Nooses it has an apex in the back. Where the knot is tied, it generally goes up behind the ears and comes to a point right there. And we actually have a term in forensics that's referred to as tinting feature, T-E-N-T-I-N-G, not T-I-N like tinting on a window. This is tinting like pup tint. And literally it's what it means. It's the shape of a pup tent, with the top of the tent being the apex of the noose itself. Dude, that doesn't exist in this case. You would see this thing coming to a point. This thing goes straight back, Dave. Straight back.
What would cause that type of an injury?
The only thing I could, I sat there in my mind and I'm thinking, okay, if you want to go with the idea of hanging, how could you generate a furrow, a ligature furrow that runs parallel to the shoulders? It goes straight back. Well, he'd have to be laying face down on the floor, as opposed to sitting up and the noose going up behind him till it reaches that peak. You would have it peaking so that you were laying on the floor face down with the thing running parallel to your shoulders.
But that's not how they found him.
No, it's not. How did they find him? Well, they found him, according to Mark Epstein and according to the reports, with his buttocks 1 inch to 1.5 inches off of the floor, which means the body was being supported by the ligature or by the noose. So the question from a scientific standpoint is how is this explained? And I think that's very, very difficult to explain, Dave.
I think it's impossible to explain. But when it got down to it, looking at this overall, you've got the autopsy done, you've got the medical examiner, and you've got Dr. Michael Bodden, who has been there watching the whole thing. They actually came to an agreement on what they believed. Is that not? Am I being accurate in that?
Yeah, and here's the thing. and I think that you and I had talked about this off air, and you'd actually mentioned it to me, and I'd heard it from another source that Dr. Sampson, I think, who is the chief medical examiner for New York, she's the one that initially ruled this as an undetermined and then changed that ruling to suicide. Here's the problem. According to Mark Epstein, Sampson was not in the autopsy suite. She's not the one that did the post. It's Dr. Roman, I think it's Christy or Kristen Roman, that actually did the autopsy with Dr. Bodden observing physically there. So in such a complex case like this, first off, why do you only have one representative from OCME in there? And then you have Dr. Bodden. I would think in a high-profile case like this, and I know that they're very busy. I know they're very busy in New York, and, that's the reality of it. But it would seem to stand to reason. I would want to try to get as many eyes as I possibly could on this case. As a matter of fact, I'd have people from U.S. Marshals. I'd probably have people from FBI physically there observing this, taking photographs, and I'd want to get everybody's name that was present in the autopsy suite. We're starting at, I don't know, whatever time they're going to start at 8 o'clock the next morning. You have an open invitation. We would strongly advise you to be here. I want as many people in that room as we possibly can. We're going to document each and everything, because when you fail to do that, when you don't have sufficient scientific backing and explanation, you're going to wind up with questions. And I don't know that we'll ever have the answers. And I think one more thing, thinking about this ligature that was used, and if you have any questions about a ligature relative to the marking that it can lead, I do this with my students at Jacksonville State to try to demonstrate the distribution of force on a surface. If you take an apple, for instance, and if you have like a piece of nylon, you wrap it around the circumference of the apple. As you begin to tighten that nylon, it can be even dental floss, you'll see that it creates a very narrow furrow in the surface of that piece of fruit, and it goes deep. Whereas if you use something like, a necktie to try to create a furrow, that furrow, though it's going to be wide, it's going to be very, very shallow. Dave, in this particular case, this furrow that runs parallel to the shoulders of Epstein is deep. It's not something that you would commonly associate with a piece of cloth running across the neck, unless that piece of cloth was twisted so very tightly that it would produce this more narrow surface. But here's the problem. We never got to see that noose, did we? Because that noose wasn't collected for evidence. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.